because I was 20 years abroad, when I came back, the incremental deterioration was more dramatic to me. So I think I was able to juxtapose what the country was like when I left and what it was like when I came back. So I think from the moment I returned from being overseas for 2 decades, I knew we were headed towards a very bad place. Um, there are all sorts of historical parallels. When you have a military as ours has become a state within a state, I studied classics, of course, they become uncontrollable. I mean, at the end of the Roman Empire, the Praetorian Guard was auctioning off to the highest bidder the role of emperor. And so this rampant militarism, again, you saw it in the Kaiser's Germany, leading to World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That pattern I noticed was being replicated. Of course, I spent my career overseas on the outer reaches of empire, so understood how empire worked. Empire is the external expression of white supremacy. Empire is, as Orwell reminded us, about markets. And this Ukrainian conflict is about markets. They're all about markets. You can't talk about war if you don't talk about markets. The loss of the economic hegemony of the United States is being countered foolishly with a desperate effort to gain or regain military hegemony. It doesn't work. It never works. It sees late empire engage in all sorts of desperate acts of military adventurism. We can go all the way back to Vietnam. The architects of the 20 years of military fiascos in the Middle East, the neocons, of course, it's kind of protean. They're neocons, liberal interventionists. They can change their name. They go from administration to administration, like Victoria Nuland or Robert Kagan. Or I had to deal with Elliott Abrams, by the way, and Kagan, who worked for him when I covered the wars in Central America. And their whole job was to discredit what those of us on the ground were reporting, and it included pretty vicious acts of character assassination. We were accused of being fifth columnists and secret members of the FMLN or the Sandinistas or whatever. So, and these people have been at it for a long time. But when you read them closely, they're complete ideologues. History has stopped in 1945. Every act of diplomacy or attempt to deal with a multipolar world, it's 1938 in Munich, and it's the new Neville Chamberlain. And then there's this vast black hole between 1945 and now. The U.S. interventions in Indonesia, in Chile, in Iran, and Guatemala. Of course, in Chile, the CIA orchestrated the assassination of the Army Chief of Staff and President Salvador Allende. And why do they, it doesn't matter how many fiascos they push us into. They've even resurrected the domino theory that if we don't expand NATO, Russia is going to be at the gates of Germany. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989, by the way, as a reporter. We all thought in our naivete that NATO was obsolete. NATO was formed to prevent Soviet expansion into Central and Eastern Europe. I was there when Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker and Margaret Thatcher, all these figures promised Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded beyond the borders of a unified Germany. But the problem is the military machine, and this was universally accepted. I mean, even Henry Kissinger, a war criminal himself, understood this. George Kennan later called the expansion of NATO to 14 states in Eastern and Central Europe the gravest mistake of the post-Cold War era. But of course, it was a $1 billion a year bonanza for the arms industry. I was in Poland a couple of years ago. There's billboards from Raytheon all over the place. Why did the war in Afghanistan get extended? Because it was lucrative and profitable to these corporations. We know from the Afghan papers that both the military and political leadership understood that this was a fiasco. And this is the problem, this rampant militarism. It's why Alexander Berkman called in the German military the enemy from within. They're unaccountable. They're a state within a state. And this is what kills off late empire, because as you have that economic decline, and George is right, we are headed for some very serious economic dislocations, they seek to compensate for that decline, and then it goes back to deindustrialization and everything else, with more aggressive militarism, which is counterproductive. In terms of censorship, I fought the U.S. government my whole life. I mean, I go back to El Salvador. The Reagan administration made war on the press. In the Middle East as well. Of course, I'm an Arabic speaker. I spent a lot of time in Gaza. And even people forget in the Balkans, because after the Dayton Peace Agreement, I was reporting that all of the war criminals and warlords were still in power. This was under Clinton, and Sandy Berger in particular, and Dick Holbrooke and others were determined to crush my reporting because Clinton was using that as a prop for his election. So there's always been a clash with government. What's different now is the corrosion within the press itself. So when I began, there was a place for someone like me. Yes, I admit my editors often thought I was a management headache, but they needed people like me who would go into places like Sarajevo, who would do this kind of work. And this was all my decision. I wanted to go there. When I volunteered to cover the war in Yugoslavia, the executive editor said, well, I guess the line starts and ends with you, because all the other New York Times reporters wanted to be the Paris bureau chief. The difference now is the corrosion within the press. That's why I'm such a fierce, as everyone here is, defender of Julian, who has not committed a crime, of course, has done the most magnificent and important work of journalism of our generation. And also I've been very outspoken about removing figures like Alex Jones or Trump from media platforms, because these entities are completely opaque. We know nothing about them. They know everything about us. And the quid pro quo, if you look closely, with the Democratic Party is that we will not break up your monopoly, but you work on our behalf. So remember, they locked the New York Post out of its own Twitter account. They discredited the contents, which was about the contents on Hunter Biden's laptop. They discredited the contents on the laptop. The New York Times called it disinformation. It was right out of the Russian playbook. Silicon Valley, we don't know because it's dark money, but spent presumably hundreds of millions of dollars on behalf of the Biden campaign. And that's why I think the fiercest call for censorship comes out of the self-identified liberal elite, because they don't want to accept responsibility for what's happened internally, or even in terms of the fiascos overseas, and they magically want to wish away this neo-fascist movement. And this is what always happens in decayed societies, or Yugoslavia is a good example. These types of figures are vomited up, a product of kind of despair and disenfranchisement and rage. And we're about to see tremendous blowback. And the way that the Biden administration is responding is not to address the dislocation, the rupturing of social bonds, the economic misery, but essentially trying to erase critics such as myself. Just to close, why was on RT? Well, first of all, I'm a strong supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which is a good way to get yourself banished from everywhere. But I'm on RT because there was this march against critics of the Democratic Party, critics of imperialism, critics of Israel. And so they put you in a marginalized space, and then they demonize that space. That's how it works. So as George said, 6 years of my shows on Contact. And by the way, there wasn't one show on Russia. And in fact, anytime we mentioned Putin, it was not flattering. And I could point you to shows, but they don't exist on YouTube anymore. But we know why they removed it. You look at the 2017 Director of National Intelligence report, the 7 pages on RT, it's all about, again, as Jill said, giving voice to Occupy activists, anti-fracking. Now, that's why. As they lose credibility, as they become more frightened of a popular backlash, then this is what always happens in decayed systems, then that censorship becomes more and more draconian. And that's what's happened. But And I'm on Substack now, which is where my friends Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi are, but they'll go after Substack. I mean, that's a subscriber survey. It's working for me. I'm resurrecting my show. I think it comes out today with Cornel West, my television show, my column. All of that gets resurrected, but they know what they're doing, and they're frightened, and they have every reason to be frightened. And they know who the targets are, and it has zero to do with Russian propaganda. Of course, that becomes, and just in terms of dinner, Jill, I want it on the record that I used to have dinner when I covered the Middle East with Muammar Gaddafi, so I don't know where that puts me. I mean, I think that I would just echo what George said. I don't think we're headed for a good time. Look at Julian's book that he published a few years ago, Cypherpunks. I mean, he saw the effective use of digital technology and wholesale surveillance as presaging a very frightening kind of corporate totalitarianism. And of course, he's right. But as George said, these people are terrified of the truth. I covered East Germany. All the typewriters were officially registered, and their typographic samples were held by the Stasi. So you couldn't type anything on an East German typewriter. It's also true in the Soviet Union that they couldn't directly trace. But this gave rise with heavy censorship, again, in the later days of the Soviet Union and East Germany, when these regimes had lost all their credibility, to the samizdat publishing, which were kind of self-publishing entities of Václav Havel's The Power of the Powerless. I think Bulgakov's Master and Margarita was also, and these just became, so the whole, Havel's whole thesis in The Power of the Powerless is that the more these people seek to cover up the truth, the more powerful the truth becomes. And there's always a way to disseminate it, although yes, the screws are certainly tightening. I expect, we already hear noises, but I expect them to go after Substack because this gives people such as Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and myself a platform. They know who the enemy is, but the tighter the control becomes, the more incendiary the truth becomes. And I think the history of dissident movements, especially in totalitarian states, is such that, yes, they can restrict the size of the platform, but they can't restrict the truth itself. The Gulag Archipelago is another samizdat publication that circulated hand by hand by hand. And that slowly chips away at the foundations of any totalitarian state. But I do think that's where we're headed. I think that, especially with the midterms, I expect the Republican Party, which is just a cultish party around Trump, to certainly take control of the Congress because of the stagnation and inability of the Biden administration, very similar to 1932 with Franz von Papen and the aristocrats in Germany, who were frightened of fascism as they should have been, but their response is to recreate the ancien regime that nobody in Weimar wants. We're in a very similar historical period that ensures the rise of these new proto-fascist movements. I think that's where we're headed. With this time, of course, they're going to come back with a vengeance because the self-identified liberal elite attempted to cancel them out. They are going to perpetuate that cancel culture, that's culture of censorship on steroids. It's going to get very ugly, and we have to also acknowledge, as George said, that economically the dislocation is going to become very severe, already at over 8% inflation. So it's going to be a tough time, but if those of us who hold fast to that imperative of truth, and are not afraid to speak it, and there will be costs, there always are costs in the end, then eventually, it may take time, but eventually that center of power will atrophy until what always overthrows these centers, and of course I saw that in Eastern Europe, is when the police and the foot soldiers will no longer protect it. They'll no longer sacrifice for a corrupt and discredited elite. That's what Crane Brinton and his book on revolution points out, that no revolution succeeds until those on the ground tasked with defending it defect, or eat portions of them defect, because that creates paralysis. I saw that in Leipzig. Honecker sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowds. Leipzig was the epicenter of the East German opposition movement, and they wouldn't do it. Honecker lasted another week in power. But I certainly think that if we draw historical parallels, the seizing up of the American system of power, its capture by a cabal of obscenely rich and corporate oligarchs, is one that will ultimately lead to its own demise. When will that happen? I don't know. Aristotle wrote in Politics that when you have an aristocratic elite like ours that takes power and deforms all of the mechanisms of power to serve their own interests, then your only two choices are revolution and tyranny.
Which will it be? Yes.
You can't tell. You can never tell. You know, it could be, go back to the 1930s. We had very powerful union movements. The Communist Party was a very important part of opposition, which we've kind of erased from American history. They saved us from a nascent fascism that many people in the ruling class, Henry Ford and others, embraced. Remember, the McCarthy was used to destroy the bonus encampments that were set up. And we got Roosevelt. I've read Roosevelt's private correspondence to his brother, and he's quite cognizant of the fact that if he doesn't begin to, these are his words, if he doesn't begin to offer concessions to a struggling population, massive unemployment and everything else, we'll get revolution. These are Roosevelt's words. And so he provides New Deal opportunities, including employing 12 million unemployed people, not out of the goodness of his heart. He came from the ruling oligarchic elite. The only probably person with a conscience in the White House was his wife, Eleanor, but because he understood the consequences of not doing so. And at the end, you know, Roosevelt said that his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. But these people are so obtuse, and again, this gets to Marx and late stage capitalism, where capitalist entities begin to cannibalize the very structures that allow them to remain in power without any kind of regulation or control. And I think that's what we're seeing. So yes, Germany went another way. Italy went another way with the same kind of economic dislocation. I think the left has been so weakened within the United States. Labor unions have been decimated and destroyed. We do see a nascent movement, the Staten Island workers at Amazon, for instance, but they're still very weak. And Amazon may never even recognize the union. They'll certainly do everything they can to destroy it. That could see our blowback essentially come in the form of a more traditional authoritarian system. We were saved from a coup on January 6th because Donald Trump is inept and spent most of his time tweeting in front of the television set. But if you get a Tom Cotton or a Mike Pompeo that come out of the military, that understand how to orchestrate these kinds of things, of course, there's already heavy voter suppression orchestrated by the Republican Party, then I think we could very well see the snuffing out of what's left of American democracy.
And then we'll be reduced to writing by hand our articles and our novels and passing them around, like you were describing.
You know, you don't stop, because, of course, I used to work for the New York Times. I'd write a front page story, and the next day the State Department would have to hold a press conference on it. I understand what the power of a platform like the New York Times can do, and I was, of course, pushed out of that platform. But that doesn't, so your power may be diminished, but that doesn't mean you don't have power, as long as you have the courage to speak the truth. I think the system, the ruling elites understand that we have no interest in the perpetuation of their power. There's a reason, as Joe said, the elections keep costing more and more. There's a reason why we're only given an alternative when in electoral politics, which is to vote against that which we hate, not that which we support. That's all by design, and I think that gets back to what we spoke about at the beginning, which is why they are imposing harsher and harsher forms of censorship. Their response is not to ameliorate the discontent, the problems that create this kind of discontent and despair, but to blot out those voices that point it out. And it's our job, no matter what they do, if we have any integrity or dignity left, is to keep raising our voice. And if that means that I end up with the only voice I have and I teach in a prison classroom, then that's what I'll do. You know, I think everyone here is fairly, I have a much harsher critique on the military than Scott. It was active military that shut down the bonus marches, also were deployed against the miners at Blair Mountain. Actually, I spent a lot of time in the Marine Corps, and I kind of like the Marines, but I did find the higher up you go, the more political games and lies they told, Westmoreland being a perfect example. But yes, we are a militarized society, and the elites will attempt to use these forces, either the paramilitary or quasi-military. Police are militarized, of course. I mean, that's what our history shows. So it's all coming. It's not good, but we can't use the word hope if we don't resist.